Good afternoon from Japan. I'm Jeffrey Ordonio, Associate Professor of International Security Studies at Tokyo International University. Today, we're going to talk about Sri Lanka and its place in the Indo-Pacific. As the region's geopolitical and security environment continue to evolve, characterized by the emergence of the so-called great power competition, small island states like Sri Lanka have become important players in international politics. Sri Lanka's location at the heart of the Indian Ocean matters a great deal, coupled with its regional and economic potential, especially if it could emerge stronger and more stable from the current crisis. Sri Lanka could be the fulcrum that tilts the strategic balance one way or another. The Hambantota port controversy wouldn't matter if Sri Lanka's role in regional affairs is negligible. Welcome to another session of TIU Global Dialogue. For this session, we're joined by Dr. Chulanee Attanayake, Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. A little bit of our speaker, Dr. Chulanee's research focus is on China and its policies in South Asia. Her book, China in Sri Lanka, a comprehensive analysis of Sino-Sri Lankan bilateral relations, was published in 2013. Prior to joining the National University of Singapore, Dr. Chulanee served as the director of the Institute of National Security Studies, Sri Lanka, a national security think tank under the Sri Lankan Ministry of Defense. Also joining us today in the other classroom is my colleague, Professor Shin Sojin, who will provide some commentaries after the presentation. Then we will proceed with Q&A. Before I turn over to our distinguished speaker, just a little bit of a disclaimer. All remarks, including those during the question and answer portion, are on the record, and we are live, not just through the Zoom platform, but also on Facebook. So please be mindful of those things. All right, so without further ado, let me turn over to our guest speaker live from Singapore, Dr. Chulanee Attanayake.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Sojin, Tokyo University, International University, for inviting me for this session. It's very interesting to engage with the student at our institute. Mostly we engage with policymakers, other scholars, analysts. So for me, this is a very interesting opportunity, and I look forward to getting more questions and interaction with the students. So as you have already mentioned, I'll be discussing Sri Lanka in the global international relations, mostly focusing on how Sri Lanka view itself as an Indian Ocean maritime state and how this identity has shaped Sri Lanka's perspective on bilateral relations and multilateral cooperation. So I would assume there are more students who do not know much about Sri Lanka compared to what you have read in the news these days. So I will give a little bit of introduction into Sri Lanka, and then from there I'll go onwards. So Sri Lanka is an island nation of 65,000 square kilometers. We are situated in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Sri Lankans consider itself as a small island state, but if you look at it from the global international theoretical perspective, it is not really so, because Sri Lanka has a population of 20 million and economy of 92.1 billion by nominal GDP and 321.8 billion by purchasing power parity. Previously, up until the economic crisis, Sri Lanka was considered a lower middle income country with a fragile economy and a debt problem. So from what you have read on Sri Lanka during the past couple of months, you may be aware of the current economic crisis the country is going through. As a country, Sri Lanka is a multi-ethnic, multicultural country. Sinhalese make up to 74.9% of the population, followed by 11.1% Sri Lankan Tamils, 9.3 Moors, and 4.1% of Tamils of Indian descent. The other 0.5 consist of small ethnic groups, including the indigenous people of Sri Lanka called Vedas, Malays, descendants from who are Malays who are descendants from Austronesian settlers, the Burghers who are descendants of European colonists. Sri Lanka's Tamil population predominantly live in the north and east of the island, and the Indian Tamils who were brought by the British in 19th century to work in tea and rubber plantation are concentrated in the center hinterland. According to the 2012 census of the country, 70% of the country is Buddhist, majority of whom are Theravada Buddhists. Then there's 12.6% of Hindus, 9.7% of Islam, and 7.6% of Christians. So the majority of Sinhalese, a sizable minority of both Sinhalese and Tamils are Christians. The Burghers are mostly Roman Catholic. Sri Lanka has a very long history. According to archaeological evidence, there has been human settlement even in the prehistory era. However, the arrival of Indo-Aryans in the 5th century BC with the arrival of Prince Vijay from India is considered the beginning of the Sinhala Buddhist civilization. Now, the reason why I'm explaining these things because these are interrelated to how Sri Lanka view itself today, and also it affects its international relations. Sri Lanka has been a sovereign nation for over 2,000 years. Yet since 230 BC, parts of Sri Lanka was invaded by South Indian Dravidian rulers from time to time. This was the only other invasion apart from the colonized rule that started in the 16th century. So this somewhat affect how Sri Lanka views its relationship with India even today. So with the arrival of the Portuguese in 1505, Sri Lanka became a colony under the European rulers, and for a half a century, Sri Lanka was under the rules of Portuguese, the Dutch, and British. At the time of independence in 1948, Sri Lanka was considered as a potential case of development success among the newly independent states. But far-reaching social, economic, political changes in the subsequent years proved that Sri Lanka could not live up to this expectation, as it is evident from the current economic crisis. Now, you may have heard a lot about the economic crisis. This is unprecedented in its history, with a high year-high balance of payment and foreign exchange deficit. A long-term dual deficit problem has finally caught up with the country's economy, and its import-dependent character. As a result of that, Sri Lanka is running low on foreign reserve needed, and as a result of that, there's shortage in essentials such as fuel, food, and other medicine and other commodities. Currently, it is negotiating for its 17th bailout package. Now, all these things are affecting how Sri Lanka is looking at itself and its relationship with the rest of the world. Given the theme of today's discussion with regard to maritime politics, I will not delve too much into the individual characteristic of Sri Lanka's foreign relations. All I can say in summary is that since independence, Sri Lanka has considered itself as a non-aligned country, but its foreign relationship has always been somewhat tilted to the east or the west, depending on the political party that has been in power. Since gaining the independence, two political parties have ruled the country or in alternate terms. So depending on their relationship, their political elites' perceptions, the relationship with the West and the East has changed. So with regard to this, we can have further questions during the discussion. So let me get back to how Sri Lanka views itself as a maritime nation and how this influences its foreign policy. Now, throughout its history, Sri Lanka's international relationship have been centered around its maritime identity. This is because Sri Lanka is, as I said, situated in the middle of the Indian Ocean region, connecting the East and the West. So foreign relations has not been something new for Sri Lanka. Historically, because Sri Lanka has used this location to its advantage, and it was an important stop as the halfway point between the two great empires of Rome and China. It had a strategic geographical advantage where the global navigation was concerned because it is situated between the 5 and 10 degree of the north latitude of the equator. So the navigational winds and monsoon affect change the direction of the maritime routes at that country. So all these ships that sailed across China and Rome had to cross through Sri Lanka. Because of this, Sri Lanka was an epicenter, is considered as an epicenter of ancient maritime trade routes. There have been numerous ancient ports called Gokarna, Jambakola Pattana, and so these are like basically Trincomalee, Hambantota, Jaffna, Mana. So several ports have been there during throughout different periods of history. So foreign merchants were attracted to the island because of its location, and their arrival, particularly of the Moors and the Arabs, had influenced the demographic composition of the country and have contributed to the multi-ethnic, multicultural identity that we have today. So it has also contributed to Sri Lanka's history of foreign relations along the Indian ocean maritime route. Sri Lanka was part of the ancient Silk Road, so it had relationship with China. And there are historical evidence that reveals Sri Lanka also had foreign relations with modern day Southeast Asian countries like Myanmar and Cambodia. So, and when we look at the colonial history itself, it is this geographical location that brought the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British, and even for a short, like couple of weeks or months, the French also to the island as colonial power, colonial rulers. So in the early years of so Sri Lanka, because of this, Sri Lanka always had this consciousness about its Indian Ocean identity. And in the early years after gaining independence from the British in 1948, also Sri Lanka continued to use this Indian Ocean identity, and the Indian Ocean continued to be present in Sri Lanka's strategic security and political narrative. So this is evident from several initiatives Sri Lanka took at the time. Colombo took the leadership in the Indian Ocean affairs during the early post-independent era, like by, for instance, founding IOMAC or Indian Ocean Maritime Affairs Corporation in 1985. This is different to IORA, which was found later, even though now IORA has taken precedence and it has become the representation of the Indian Ocean region. So the IOMAC was found with the intention of building cooperation between the Indian Ocean region countries. And Sri Lanka also took the lead in declaring the Indian Ocean as a zone of peace during the Cold War period. I'll get back to that point later in this discussion. However, since the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Indian Ocean rhetoric becomes absent from Sri Lanka's strategic consciousness. This could be primarily because Colombo was preoccupied with its 3 decades of protracted conflict, And it can also be because so it had limited resources to uh, put in pushing its Indian Ocean identity alongside with its identity as a South Asian country, because during this same period, SAARC, or the South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation, uh, um, becomes a bit prominent as a body to integrate South Asian region. So during this period, Sri Lanka identifies itself as a South Asian country more than as an Indian Ocean country. Now, with the end of the conflict, however, we see a shift in this discourse. The relationship between the Indian Ocean and Sri Lanka is looked through new meaning by successive governments, particularly as a way of connecting with the booming trade and economic network in the region. So successive governments have claimed Sri Lanka's Indian Ocean identity and have incorporated it into the policies and strategies. So the idea of being an Indian Ocean country is reflected in how Sri Lanka wanted to promote itself as as a center of the Indian Ocean. So soon after the end of the conflict, the government of Sri Lanka emphasized its interest in making Sri Lanka the naval, air, and commercial hub in this Indian Ocean region. This was repeatedly highlighted in the election manifesto of Mahinda Rajapaksa, and then this concept dominated subsequent policy documents and decision making of that government. So massive investments in port and airport related infrastructure were meant to facilitate this leap forward in becoming a trade and connectivity hub in the region. Later, when Sirisena Wickremesinghe government came into power in 2015, they also continued with the same policy. So they particularly spelled out the importance of reclaiming. They used the word reclaiming Sri Lanka's Indian Ocean identity. In 2015, then Foreign Minister Mangala Samaravira emphasized that Sri Lanka should reclassify itself as an Indian Ocean state instead of South Asian nation. He explained, so I quote, reclaiming our Indian Ocean identity help us and others unlock the tremendous opportunity for attracting FDI, accessible markets, and developing tourism industry. His deputy foreign minister, Harsha De Silva, uh, supported the same position, explaining that the idea of reclaiming the Indian Ocean identity beyond South Asia will help the island and other interested countries to unlock these tremendous opportunities for mutual benefit and in creating the new reality in the emerging Asian century. This was followed by incorporating the concept of blue economy in policy documents as a foundation to the country's economic development. So this idea was picked up by the policy circles, analysts alike, and they started emphasizing on the fact that Sri Lanka was never just a South Asian nation since history, which is true because its historical names such as Taprobane, Ceylon, derived from its strategic position in the heart of the Indian Ocean. These were the names given to Sri Lanka by mostly the travelers from the European countries. So while the influence of Indian subcontinent on large part of Sri Lanka's cultural, social, and demographic composition is true, this particular step admits and acknowledges the influence of Indian Ocean's navigation culture that Sri Lanka has also influenced by. So when today Sri Lankan government's reform policies to reflect this Indian Ocean identity, and it is recalling Sri Lanka's place in the history and repositioning itself to maximize its relationship with both historic and new trading partners. So since reviving this concept of Indian Ocean identity, Sri Lanka has been active both bilaterally and multilaterally to emphasize this factor. So maritime diplomacy and aspirations are increasingly becoming more assertive. For instance, in Sri Lanka is now focusing on maritime domain awareness to realize its maritime security interests. In 2016, Sri Lanka Navy came up with a strategic document called Maritime Strategy 2025, followed by another document called Maritime Doctrine of Sri Lanka, published in 2020. Now, both these documents provide insight into Sri Lanka's maritime security, maritime identity, maritime security challenges emanating from the development in the Indo-Pacific region, and issues and challenges faced by Sri Lanka because of its Indian Ocean environment. It also focuses on maritime capabilities and what are the areas that Sri Lanka should focus more. Beside that, Sri Lanka continues and has increased its joint maritime exercises with Indian Ocean countries. Colombo always had joint naval exercises with India. Right now, it has become even more frequent and expanded. Sri Lanka has a bilateral maritime exercise called SLINEX, Sri Lanka India Naval Exercise, that has been having continuing regularly, yearly. Since 2012, Sri Lanka also became a part of Dosti exercise between India and the Maldives. So Dosti was initial, now I think it's approximately 25 years or 30 years old. This was initially a bilateral exercise between the Maldives and India. So with Sri Lanka's addition in 2012, now this has become a trilateral exercise. Sri Lanka has also always had bilateral naval relationship with the United States. In 1995, it participated in joint exercises with the US, and when Sri Lanka was included in the Pacific Command's military exercise. In 2003, Sri Lanka joined the military exercises with trainings and focusing on arms operation and medical techniques. Then Sri Lanka has been part of Carrot exercise several times. The highlight of the entire relationship perhaps is in 2018, Colombo joined RIMPAC exercise with the United States. So RIMPAC is US largest military exercise with its partnering countries. Sri Lanka also have joint exercises with China, even though there is nothing frequent and yearly like SLINEX. And the Sri Lankan forces and China has joined in Cormorant exercises that was initiated in 2010. It has developed military relations or naval relations with Australia also recently. In March 2019, Australia deployed its biggest naval deployment in Sri Lanka for the Indo-Pacific Endeavour 19. So this was a recognition of Sri Lanka for Australia's military activities in the region. Sri Lanka and Japan also have strengthened their cooperation in maritime security. Major developments are perhaps in the maritime arena took place in 2018. The defense minister Itsunori Ondera visited Sri Lanka, making it the first ever visit by a Japanese defense minister to Colombo. And then the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force hosted maritime exercise with Sri Lanka Navy to deal with perceived challenges in the Indian Ocean region. Tokyo's biggest warship, the cargo helicopter carrier, chartered its way into Colombo Harbor as a part of goodwill visit. Since then, there has been several port calls by Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force to Colombo. Apart from the bilateral ties, Sri Lanka has sought to develop its profile as an Indian Ocean state through several um, activities in multilateral fora and initiating events such as the Gaul Dialogue and associating as a key organizer of forums such as Indian Ocean Conference. Sri Lanka is an active member of several multilateral initiatives within the Indian Ocean region. It has a history of using this platform to raise concerns and issues. So, as I mentioned in previously, during the Cold War period, Sri Lanka took the initiative to campaign for the Indian Ocean Zone of Peace. So, this was at the height of the Cold War. Sri Lanka, along with Tanzania, introduced to the United Nations at the 26th UN General Assembly in 1971. This was spearheaded by then Prime Minister Sri Bandaranaike, and the concept of zone of peace was adopted as soft law through the UN General Assembly Resolution 2832 to maintain peace and stability in the region. So the proposal not only advocated for a rule-based order, but also shed light into the challenges faced by small island states like Sri Lanka at time of power struggle between major players. And this is something that is even relevant today because we see increasing geopolitical power struggle in the Indian Ocean region. So the Gaul dialogue is perhaps Sri Lanka's latest initiative, which emphasizes its maritime interest and maritime identity. This is Sri Lanka Navy's major international conference, began in 2010, and it is an institutionalized platform for Sri Lanka to engage with the maritime world. This is held annually and it brings together top naval officials, diplomats, policymakers, academics, strategic analysts from all over the world to discuss and share maritime issues, concerns, knowledge, and vision. Sri Lanka is also founding associate since 2016 of the Indian Ocean Conference hosted by the New Delhi-based India Foundation. So the Gaul dialogue and has developed into a significant maritime related policy discussion platform in the region and has reminded the world of Sri Lanka's previous leadership role in maritime issues in the island, in the Indian Ocean region. Recently, Sri Lanka also sorted active role in several platforms in IORA. It was appointed in 2017 as the lead coordinator of its working group on maritime security and safety. The UN Office on Drug and Crime opened an office in Sri Lanka to headquarter the Indian Ocean Forum on Maritime Crime, and that act as a regional coordination platform for law enforcement against maritime crime in the Indian Ocean. And now these kind of initiatives are both to facilitate Sri Lanka's relationship with the rest of the world, but also to address its own national security challenges. Because Indian Ocean is Sri Lanka's immediate environment, majority of its challenges for national security are also coming from there. It is vulnerable to increasing geopolitical tension, naval competition, and resulting destabilized security in the region. With the geopolitical tension between the US-led Western Bloc and China that is unveiling in the Indian Ocean region, the conventional naval and nuclear balance in the region is diminishing, and this is challenging Sri Lanka. Apart from that, the Indian Ocean is also subjected to numerous non-traditional security issues such as small arms and light weapons, trafficking, human trafficking, drug trafficking. These are also impacting Sri Lanka's security. For instance, Sri Lanka is currently identified as a transit point for human and drug smuggling. The drug producing and illicit arm trades areas of the Golden Crescent and Golden Triangle lie within the region. And according to Sri Lanka's National Dangerous Drug Control Board reports, uh, island is being used as a transit point to smuggle heroin from India and Pakistan to Europe via containers and mechanized fishing crafts. So even though Sri Lankan Navy has managed to apprehend such attempts, they are being challenged by enormity of the ocean space Sri Lanka is responsible for and the limited human and other resources Sri Lanka has. Because even though Sri Lanka is comparatively a small country, it has ocean space exclusive economic zone that is 7 times of the size of its land. And apart from drugs, explosives, and small and armed ammunition smuggled via the sea routes, Sri Lanka is also vulnerable for maritime terrorism. This was experienced especially during the time of LTT terrorism. Sri Lanka was a breeding ground for illegal small arms trade. And even though this is eradicated now, the region is undergoing multiple inter and intra-border conflicts, as we see in Afghanistan and adjoining areas. So, given how terrorism operates beyond borders, Sri Lanka cannot be entirely at ease that this would not re-emerge in its maritime territory. So the lack of credible and coordinated system to account for the smuggling of drugs, small arms, and other issues in the regional countries is one of the key issues challenging Sri Lanka's security. Similarly, human trafficking and illegal migration is emerging as a threat due to earlier due to its conflict history. Sri Lanka is considered as a source country for illegal migration, and it is encouraged by the foreign networks engaged in trafficking for cargoes across the borders and linked with maritime terrorism and terrorist financing. So there are increasing incidents in which many foreign illegal asylum seekers who used Thailand and Indonesia as transit points are now using Sri Lanka as a transit point. And apart from this, there are other issues such as maritime piracy and illegal and unreported fishing issues. Especially about IUU fishing, Sri Lanka is vulnerable because it affects from this and also other environmental pollution, climate change issues. IUU fishing has proven to be more problematic for fishers that straddle the country's exclusive economic zones, and it contributes to the overexploitation of fish stocks and hinders the recovery of fish population in Sri Lanka's maritime environment. So while Sri Lanka recognizes these challenges, Sri Lanka also admits that because as a small country with limited capabilities and resources, it requires the cooperation and assistance with other countries. That's why it is increasingly engaging with other countries like India, United States, Australia, China, Japan, via bilateral and multilateral platforms. Um, to find solutions for these problems. So I think it like my time is almost up. So in conclusion, Indian Ocean, I would say is Sri Lanka's immediate environment, and Sri Lanka's development and relationship with the outside world is dependent on this strategic environment. So as Sri Lanka is reviving its maritime identity in the recent years, that is a factor that admitting that the importance of engagement and cooperation with the rest of the world via the Indian Ocean region. Thank you.
All right. So thank you very much, Dr. Chulanee. Having heard from our speaker, in a couple of minutes, I'll turn to our students here, our online audience, to provide their own feedback and also questions. If you have a question or a comment, please use, if you're joining us through Zoom, please use the Q&A function or the chat if you want. Or if you're in the classroom, please just raise your hand and Professor Shin and I will call on you. So just to jumpstart our conversation, let me first turn over to my colleague here, Professor Shin Sojin, who will provide some of her thoughts. Professor Shin is Associate Professor of Political Economy here at TIU and an expert on South Asia. Professor Shin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much, Chulanee, for very informative and timely talk about Sri Lanka's maritime identity and international relations. Well, as a global citizen loving Sri Lanka's people and culture, I was disheartened to see how citizens were suffering from the current political and economic crisis. And as an IR scholar and political scientist, I would like to address this socio-political and economic turmoil with the two important factors. One, external and structural constraints which were triggered by the pandemic and following the Russia and Ukraine war. And two, Sri Lanka's domestic constraints like the mismanagement of economic policy and the absence of strong government, which can be equipped with capable technocrats who could advise the Rajapaksa regime over the heavy borrowings from the foreign actors. The new government under the Ranil Wickremesinghe's leadership recently agreed on the IMF's bailout plan and presented a very strong will to tackle the economic crisis. So it will be quite difficult for us actually to expect the external constraints to be removed very soon, but the domestic constraints can be fixed. So I would like to learn your insight on how Wickremesinghe's leadership's framework on Indian Ocean identity, Sri Lanka's identity, can actually help the new government to build the government capability or capacity to exceed from the economic crisis in the next few years. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Professor Shin. Do we have any question from our audience? We have one question here on the chat. So one of our students here asked, and let me just read the question. As you have said that Sri Lanka, despite being non-aligned, will tilt towards different sides depending on the ruling party. The question here is, how do you think will be the foreign policy orientation of Sri Lanka given the domestic changes that has happened recently? Dr. Chulanee, I think you're muted.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so thank you, both are very interesting questions. Thank you, Sojin, for the questions. So I'll first, I think both are interrelated, so I will answer them together. So yes, I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation how Sri Lanka's foreign policy is supposedly non-aligned, but also have change. I mean, somewhat tilted to the west or the east, depending on the political party in power. So Sri Lanka has two major political parties, United National Party and Sri Lanka Freedom Party. Since Sri Lanka gained independence, these parties or their alliances have always ruled the country. There has not been any third party that has taken power. So UMP is a center-right party. SLFP is a center-left party. Current major opposition is a breakaway group of UMP. The SLPP, or the Sri Lanka Podujana Party, which is also known as Rajapaksa's party, is a breakaway group of Sri Lanka Freedom Party. So there is no major shift in the foreign policy orientation or the way that they look at foreign policy when these parties are in power. Interestingly, right now, there is even in 2015, there is an alliance between the UMP and the SLFP, some groups of these two political parties. So actually, right now, I would say it will tilt towards certain countries or the group of countries, depending on the situation or what's happening in the country. So because of that, so both Sojin's question and the question that Jeff asked are related to how this current foreign policy orientation would change according to what has happened at the moment. So what we see right now is that Sri Lanka reaching out to every country and every multilateral platform to come out of its economic crisis. The priority has become the economic crisis and how to resolve the existing economic crisis. Because of this, they are trying to balance the relationship with China and India in particular, and also reaching out to countries like Japan and United States and other countries in Europe. In the meantime, Sri Lankan government has made it very clear that it is serious and going ahead with the IMF bailout package as the first priority, even though China, as one of Sri Lanka's major creditors, have raised its concern on its own. Now, given in this context, what I would say is I don't think we can call it a non-aligned foreign policy, so to say, but more of a pragmatic policy where engaging with all parties equally when and where necessary in order to come out of the economic crisis, and from there onwards to focus on its relationship. And how Ranil Wickremesinghe government's Indian Ocean perception would impact this. So when it comes to Sri Lanka's centrality in the Indian Ocean region, there has been no difference between any political groups. They admit that Sri Lanka is placed in a strategic position in the Indian Ocean region. They admit that this is an asset that we have to use. And so use this position as their strategic advantage. So therefore, this government itself will use that same strategy, try to use the geographical location as its strategic advantage. And actually what we see from the rhetoric is that using this geographic position or the strategic geographic location to connect with the trading networks and the economic networks in order to bring foreign direct investments and connect with the export markets in the region. This is because Sri Lanka has it is situated in the middle of the shipping lane. Sri Lanka believe that the other countries who would provide, like invest in Sri Lanka, will have great advantage in connecting with the West and the East at a lower cost. Secondly, despite all the other economic and political turmoil Sri Lanka experienced since its independence, Sri Lanka has higher human development index. Sri Lanka has a very well educated population, as a result of which its major resource actually is human resource. So for the countries who are interested in using the human resource for service industries and other industries, Sri Lanka is a very good location. So I think that is, and apart from that, because of our positioning, we can connect with the West and the East. Like the time difference is that not that too strange. So connect with both these world in a comfortable time zone. So considering all these aspects, Sri Lankan, whether it's Vikramasinghe government or the other governments, have always emphasized on the strategic geographical location. So I don't see any change into that perception. I don't expect that perception to change in this government either.
Thanks, Dr. Chulanee. I wonder if I could press you on that. I have a curious question about the implication of the 99-year lease of China over the Hambantota port. I wonder if there is any update on that, or if there is any discussion in Sri Lanka about China potentially turning that unprofitable venture into a military base or a naval base in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And how is the development on Hambantota port impacts the strategic environment in the Indian Ocean region?
Right. So I think the impact of Hambantota port as a strategic port for the Indian Ocean context, this is well discussed and debated, analyzed in the international media. So I don't want to go into that. Looking from a pure Sri Lankan perspective, I do not think that I can agree on the fact that it was an unprofitable port. Let me tell you why. As I said, Sri Lanka had ancient ports in the history as well, and Hambantota was one of it. And it is even closer to the shipping lane compared to any other port in Sri Lanka. So there was never a question of its business viability. I think from the beginning, because China was involved in the project, there was a lot of geopolitical interest on the project, so that its commercial viability did not really get enough attention. So yes, when it was initially started operation, it did not make profit. And I don't think we can expect making a profit soon, like for a completely new project within 1 year or 2 years. Plus, Sri Lanka is not a industrial country, which makes a lot of products. So as a result of, and Sri Lanka do not have a major shipping line. So usually it was meant to be a partnership with a major shipping corporation, and to be used with the shipping network. So like the same company that operate Hambantota is operating another terminal in Colombo port, which has made Colombo port the fastest growing port in this region. And currently, Colombo has become transshipment hub because of after CM Port started operating that terminal. And if you look at the, I do not have the statistics at the moment, but the recent statistic on Hambantota port itself shows that it has grown quite significantly during the past few years. And Hambantota port was not made to do the same business as it was doing in Colombo. It was meant to do RoRo, provide fuel refueling and other ports related services. Now, one can ask why this cannot be done in Colombo. Colombo geographical location do not suit for this kind of project, particularly because there are no land to expand around the port anymore. Colombo is a metropolitan city. It's very well packed, and there is no way of expanding the port anymore. Whereas Hambantota was one of the least developed areas in Sri Lanka. It had this space so that port and port related industries could grow. So I think, in my personal opinion and in my observation and discussion with people in the port industry in Sri Lanka as well, one of the reasons why Hambantota garnered so much of negative attention, partly because of the geopolitical tension in the Indian Ocean region, partly because of domestic politics in the region, in Sri Lanka. Usually it's, I think perhaps it's somewhat common to any South Asian politics. When one political party do something, the other political party usually oppose it. So and Hambantota case is one of the best cases to give this example. When Hambantota port was developing, when it was constructing, the party in power was SLFP, or the Rajapakshas, and the UMP opposed it. But when in 2017, when it was leased to CM ports for operation, it was the other way around, and the Rajapakshas opposed it. So therefore, it's a very complicated scenario, and unfortunately, it has given very lot of negative perceptions about the viability of the port. In particular, with regard to Hambantota port, that's the case. And to my knowledge, its security and security is controlled by Sri Lanka Navy, and there had never been any incident where Chinese have involved in those things. And to my knowledge, there were several. I cannot remember exactly the years, but there were port visits by Japanese and United States foreign diplomats and major officials to Hambantota port without an issue. So I cannot exactly remember the dates. This was after it was leased to Hambantota.
Okay,
right?
So just very briefly on that, the 99-year lease of China was not the result of Sri Lanka defaulting on its loans?
Obviously not. It was a misconception. It was not an equity swap, even though it is claimed as equity swap. Sri Lanka's major loans with China starting to mature only in 2024. Actually, the current debt problem is because of commercial lenders. So, but at that time has happened, what happened mainly was Sri Lanka getting the FDI from China for the 99-year lease and using that FDI to pay its commercial creditors.
All right.
So this that is, I think, another aspect that has been wrongly perceived when it comes to Sri Lanka and China debt. It doesn't mean that there's no debt problem. There is a debt problem, but that problem is yet to come. So that's why, I think IMF and even Sri Lankan government is trying to bring China on board in its debt restructuring discussions.
All right, so we have questions from Rehan and Buthmi. Buthmi from Sri Lanka. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. I'll say it out loud. Yes. Could you?
So I'm Buthmi, and I'm a
do you hear the question? Sorry, Chulanee, do you hear?
Sorry, Sojin, it's not clear. Would you mind coming a bit closer to the computer? Thank you.
So she is Putami from Sri Lanka. She is
Hi.
most active students in my class, and
Right.
a wonderful presentation about Sri Lanka's profile, country profile last week.
Right. And where are you from in Sri Lanka? Colombo. Okay.
So you said the ports of Sri Lanka is very important to the economic growth and the location is very strategic. But do you think the ownership of these ports by China affects the way these ports will be used in the future, such as Port City, and in turn affect Sri Lanka's economic sovereignty?
Well, that depends on how Sri Lanka engages in this project. As I said, actually, in my observation, Chinese interest in Sri Lanka's port industry actually has been a catalyst of generating interest by the other countries. For instance, if you are following how the port investments are happening in Sri Lanka, last year we got Adani Ports from India investing in Sri Lanka. This was after Chinese investment came into Sri Lanka. There has been major, like Sri Lanka's port industry is very well connected with the Indian port industry because we do majority of the transshipments for India. And even when Sri Lanka invited for investments from India for the port industry, it has never happened. It was only after Chinese investments that India saw this as a strategic opportunity and is now investing there. So in my understanding, this has been a win-win situation from a Sri Lankan side, because what we have to understand is like these, whether it's from India or China or anywhere else, when a company comes and invests in port industry, they bring their entire port network. So if I know that in Sri Lanka we have this whole discussions about economic sovereignty and all that, and there were a lot of protests against even Adani port investments, and even before that, several times. But we have to admit that Sri Lanka, we do not produce enough goods to export on our own. And we don't even have one, I think we have only one or two ships belong to Ceylon Shipping Corporation. So with that, we cannot operate an entire port. So for that, we need investments from other countries. So I do not think that this is affecting the economic sovereignty in some way or the other. In fact, I believe that it will actually it has boosted Sri Lanka's economic development in terms of port industry.
I have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So, like, if you look at Port City in like a grander scheme of things, do you think it will affect like diplomatic relations of Sri Lanka with other countries if you're going to be if it's owned by China or whatnot, and if we need like special access or whatever to go into this area, which is Port City, do you think it will affect our diplomatic relations with other countries?
Well, that's why Sri Lanka, no country, Sri Lanka should act on its own sovereignty, and we have to make the rules on it. And we should not make Port City exclusive to one country or the other. We should make it open. And you can have a lot more information on its economic viability and how this could be Sri Lanka's leap forward in development. There are very interesting reports by PwC and another, I can't remember. So they the way that we can handle this is by making it open to all the investors and making it equally open to every investor. And that is very important. And I don't think that even China on its own can operate one single port city of this caliber, because if you go and look at it, it's massive. The development going there is massive. I don't think there will be even, I think China has only even they have mentioned only a portion of investments that will come from there. That doesn't mean every investment is going from going to come from China. So Sri Lanka has to be aware of it and make use of its relationship. So the diplomatic relationship, the way that we handle our diplomatic relationship is up to us. And for that, we need a very good, capable foreign service, which is like a completely a different discussion. So those are the things that I think we, like in this time period, like we have to see
Thank you very
kind
much.
of changes.
Thank you. The next question from Rehan.
Yeah, hello, my name is Ryan.
Hi.
So, I have questions about the domestic regime in Sri Lanka. So nowadays, I heard the news that Gotabaya Rajapaksa already went back to Sri Lanka, and I got surprised that there is some of people that cheering the back of Gotabaya Rajapaksa. And after I just got confused about how the domestically or the society in Sri Lanka sees the Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Rajapaksa regime in Sri Lanka. And I heard the news that the same party is still have a power in Sri Lanka. How it is can be change the position of Sri Lanka in international sphere or international community, because I think nowadays Sri Lanka is maybe is having want to some kind of gaining trust with other countries in maybe like China or something that want to invest in Sri Lanka. How it can be affected by that? How it can the Rajapaksa regime and party still leading Sri Lanka is can affect the trust of the international community. And my second question is very interesting for me that you are mentioning about the vulnerable of policy, CIS policy, maritime policy in Sri Lanka. And according to World Bank, that Sri Lanka now have near 1 million visitors, and how it can be is mining over 30 years until now. How can Sri Lanka's government look this the fishing industry? Because nowadays I think Sri Lanka have been the good quality of export, fishing export into the export to other country. Yeah.
I'm sorry, but I didn't get the second question correctly. Are you asking about the IUU fishing?
Yeah, yeah. But the
Okay, how that is going to support Sri Lanka's economy, is it?
yeah, and how through the years this policy is examining, how it can be important for the Sri Lanka government.
Okay, so about the first question, Sri Lanka has always had dynastic politics. When one dynasty ends, another one emerges. That was the same with Rajapaksa regime. And if you remember, Gotabaya Rajapaksa won the election with one of the largest majorities in Sri Lanka's electoral history. So I do not think that you can immediately expect every country to be to reject them. Actually, if you look at there was a survey in Sri Lanka done by a Sri Lankan think tank, which started towards the end of middle of the COVID period and beginning the through to go up until the current crisis. So there, one of the factors that was very evident was that the changes or the people's response to Gotabaya Rajapaksa or their rejection began when the economy started going down, because of when the fuel shortage emerged, when there were hours of power cuts. That's where their rejection started. So which means that there are a lot of international discourse on international platforms about Rajapaksa, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, perceived as authoritarian figure, and because of that people rejected him, etc., etc. But to me, I think people voted him knowing all those characteristics. So, and perhaps people also, if you listen to some of the comments on local media in local languages, you also see like there are comments where people making about like his failure to make those prompt decision, like authority, like as a strong, what they perceived him as a strong person. For them, like authoritarian or otherwise, he was considered as a strong person. So like failure to do that was as a reason for him to rejecting Rajapaksa. So because of that, I do not expect people to completely like everyone to completely fall out of that camp immediately. With regard to IUI, like in illegal and unregulated fishing issue in Sri Lanka, so even though Sri Lanka has ocean 7 times the bigger as its land, Sri Lanka has not fully utilized it up until now. There has been discussions and policy making policies with regard to using this. And however, it like I have not seen very concrete policies to manage this issue. Sri Lanka gets the majority of its like IUU related problem from its Indian maritime border, and because of so many reasons, including managing diplomatic ties with India, has affected the way Sri Lanka addressed this IUU fishing in its northern maritime border. So I'm sorry if I did not get your question correctly. I did not properly hear your question well. So from my understanding, like there's a lot of potential in IUU and there's admission of the problem, but there has not been very concrete a response into the issue.
All right, we're actually out of time, but with the indulgence of our speaker, maybe we can have one more round of questions.
Yeah.
So let me take 3 questions here and on the chat, and then 1 question here in the classroom. So first, a question from another Sri Lankan student, D. Let me just read her question. Earlier on, you mentioned how Sri Lanka is attempting to reshape its identity and reclaim its title as an Indian Ocean nation versus its previous identity as a South Asian nation.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering how that relates to SAARC's overall lack of unity, and if that also implies that Sri Lanka is not placing as much importance on its South Asian neighbors and instead trying to focus on players in the wider geopolitical region. So that's question number 1. Another question from Chiquita. Having a crucial role in the maritime affairs in the Indian Ocean, how does Sri Lanka's involvement in IORA and IOMAC help neighboring developing nations advance their maritime interests, especially against bigger, more developed nations? And last question here on the chat. There is a question that's probably related to the last question that you answered about IUU fishing. She's curious about what can be done in Sri Lanka's case without causing problems like human trafficking, the non-traditional security problems that you've mentioned, without causing these activities to be relocated somewhere else. So that's those are the 3 questions that we have on the chat. We have here one more in the classroom. Michael?
Yeah, how does Chinese presence in Sri Lanka?
Sorry, Jeff, I cannot hear him properly. Would you mind in the meantime telling, like summarizing the first question again?
Do you want me to repeat the questions?
Yeah, the first one.
Okay, so the first question is about the identity of Sri Lanka as an Indian Ocean nation versus South Asian nation. Is Sri Lanka now prioritizing engagements with other countries outside the region, which means that it's not placing as much importance anymore on its neighbors. So that's the question of one Sri Lankan student. Second question is about Sri Lanka's involvement in the EORA and EOMAC, which I think you have discussed extensively, and how these engagements relate to how Sri Lanka is engaging with bigger, more powerful nations. And last question is about the non-traditional security issues. What can Sri Lanka do so these activities are not relocated somewhere else? And then, if you're ready, Michael is here, ready to ask his China-related question.
How does increased Chinese presence in the region affect the stability of the region, and also with India?
How Chinese presence in the region
affects the stability of the region. And
okay. Right.
Dr. Chulanee, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Okay, about the identity, Indian Ocean identity versus South Asian identity. I don't think that Sri Lanka trying to disregard its South Asian identity. It's just that trying to bring back its Indian Ocean identity that was not that was abandoned for a couple of decades in the past. I mean, we have to admit, those who are aware of South Asian region knows that SAARC is not functioning anymore. India is slowly backing out of SAARC, and because of India-Pakistan issue, it's not happening. India is putting more and more effort and resources into BIMSTEC, and Pakistan is more focused in Central Asian region right now. So we do not know how SAARC will form in the future. But Sri Lanka is continuing its relationship with its South Asian neighbors. It has built strong bilateral it is building bilateral economic ties with Bangladesh, for instance. Bangladesh even has provided currency swap during the economic crisis. It is developing security partnership with Maldives. So for the SAARC region to become integrated, I think all the countries in the South Asian region has to come sit and discuss the main issue why it is not functioning, which is the India-Pakistan problem. So unless that happens, I don't think it will go anywhere. So and in such a situation, I don't think it makes sense for Sri Lanka also just to hang on to it and see like where it's going to take Sri Lanka. So rather it's more appropriate for Sri Lanka to look into other options and other avenues to realize its interest. And that's exactly what Sri Lanka is doing. It is trying to identify itself with the Indian Ocean region more so that it can connect with this growing trade and economic network in the region. So when it comes to the second question about IRA and IOMAC, Sri Lanka's role in that and how that would help the other small countries. I think Sri Lanka, as I mentioned earlier also, using these platforms to raise issues particularly important for small countries like South Asia. So for small countries like Sri Lanka, so we know that it's very difficult for a small country to raise their concerns on its own. So multilateral platforms usually provide this space to raise these concerns. So I mentioned that Sri Lanka is part of the Maritime Safety and Security grouping of IORA, and it is using this platform to raise these concerns. Even in BIMSTEC, where it is giving the leadership to the group on subgroup on technology, it is raising the challenges small countries are facing and what the other countries can do in order to help these countries. So for other small countries also, it is an important platform to gather together and raise their common issues. The issues on drug trafficking, smuggling, or maritime terrorism, these are very common to every country in this region. So IRA and IOMAC, of course, it's not that functional anymore, but IRA has been of great platform to do all that. Yeah, so with regard to non-traditional security issues, I have the same answer for that. For countries like Sri Lanka, who do not have resources or capability on its own to address these issues, cooperation with other countries and raising these issues and bringing attention of other for these issues in the multilateral platforms is the way forward. Finally, about the increasing Chinese presence and how it affects the stability of the Indian Ocean region. I mentioned it in my presentation also. It is greatly affecting the regional balance. We see that major players competing to change their nuclear balance as well, putting more and more resources to their nuclear capabilities and other military capabilities. So it's actually a conflict and a competition between the major powers, but countries like Sri Lanka are going to be affected largely because there is nothing much that Sri Lanka can or countries like Sri Lanka can do to prevent it. It only can look at ways how we can manage the situation.
All right. That was a very insightful discussion. Thank you very much to our speaker, Dr. Chulanee Attanayake, for sharing her expertise and time with us this afternoon. Also to my colleague, Professor Shin Sojin, for organizing this very instructive session. And to our audience, our students, for joining us this afternoon. Thanks everybody. Join us again next time.